It's time for us to begin this morning. If you go ahead and open of Job, chapters 20 and 21, but we are going to pay attention to chapters 18 and 19 just to kind of walk back into where we were last week as a brief connective review. Before we get into our study and the conversation about the text, let's go ahead, though, and bow together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we share together in spiritual things. We thank you for the gift of redemption found in Jesus. Help us as disciples and followers of Christ to move in ways that strengthen hearts and strengthen souls. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. So the text of Job is, as we've said before, a combination of things. It is one part wisdom. That's why we group it categorically in the literature of wisdom texts. It is certainly historical to a degree, with the exception that it never really gives us a time frame. It just said this happened. It doesn't really connect it to any other biblical stories. You know, it's not latched into the kings. It's not latched into the patriarchs. Most timelines place it somewhere in the 2000 or so BC kind of area, plus or minus a couple hundred years, just trying to figure out where it might be in all of this. The names that are used in it aren't really repeated in other lineages, so there's not a whole lot of connective tissues that bring it into history. But on a development of understanding side, that is, what does Israel know? What does Israel think? What does Israel perceive concerning God? It is one of the strongest historical texts that talk about one of the most challenging parts of building your understandings of God, of the afterlife, of the spiritual realm, because it forces us to do the fancy word, theology, but the more practical thing of taking two Bible passages, holding them in one hand each, and saying, what do these mean? That's theology. That's all that is. It's saying, I got this thing here, I got this thing over here. When I hold on to both of them, how do they live together? How do they hold together? And so with all of that, we've reached kind of zenith, if you will, of the Old Testament when we were looking particularly at chapter 19. Because we had climbed with Job in these dialogues to what might be one of the most theologically forward-looking passages of the Old Testament text. We don't know all that Job knows. Job doesn't know all that we know. He's living inside the story rather than outside it. That's that passage 19 verse 25 that says, I know my Redeemer lives. It's a wild statement from the limited amount of information that's been given to us in this time frame as we're trying to think about it as an Old Testament world when this passage is initially being laid out. This morning, what we're going to do is dive back into this story by having to go back down the mountain. We're going to go into the dialogue of round 3, if you will. Zophar is going to speak in chapter 20. And if you thought the earlier things were rough, and the stuff that some of them were saying to Job were harsh, Zophar decides to take the amplifier that normally goes to 9 or 10 and say this one's going to go all the way to 11. And he says some things that are going to be really tough in this last word. And then Job asks a really important question. Why is it that the wicked prosper? What's going on there? That's a hard thing to think about when the application of some of the ideas that are being tossed out are getting to a little bit more personal level. Because I think on a practical level, all of us have asked that question in one way or another. Well, I've been living this way, I've been thinking this way about God, I've been doing my very best to do what He tells me to do, and then these other folks just do whatever they want, and they seem to be okay. On an earthly level, if I were to ask the raise of hands, if you've thought that way before, I'm pretty sure we'd get 100% or close to it. Especially when our life is getting a little bit more thin. We're a little more stressed out, a little more pressure, a little more responsibility. When that happens, is it stressful? And yet, on a general sense, is that a feeling you guys have had in the past? Like, hey, why are these evil people making good money, seemingly having a good life? Anecdotally, there's a lot more research underneath this, but anecdotally, when you poll Americans, not other nations, but general Americans, there's an interesting balance that comes. One would think that financial prosperity is the clearest indicator of contentment, right? If you have enough money to pay the bills, you're going to be happy. You realize that that's not the case, statistically speaking? You are more likely, statistically, to find content, happy people who go to church, independent of their money. One might also think that family pressures are going to be the big thing. Like, how am I going to pay to feed my family? Larger families that go to church statistically often have happier experiences than smaller families that go to church together. But I can tell you from my own experiences and talking to other friends, a lot of stress taking care of a family, making sure everyone's fed, making sure everyone has the meals, the homework's done. It wears you out. If you talk to mamas that are raising kids and they're in the thick of it, and ask them when the last time they had a shower to themselves or went to the bathroom and nobody knocked on the door, you've asked a question that should not be asked at all, because you're not going to like the answer. It's been a bit. But we think, well, if you have all this money and you can outsource all these responsibilities and there's no stress, then clearly you're going to be happier and more content. It's the opposite. Anecdotally, there's a lot of other competing factors that go into that, other contexts, other situations, but pretty strongly it's a good causation relationship that going to church has a higher likelihood of producing happiness and contentment than stacking up lots of cash, independent of what we might feel about it. So when we get to this conversation that's going on here and we start thinking about this, there's a number of things that take place. And so, quick recovery, chapters 18 and 19 that are kind of laying this out. Bildad had this long, awful discussion. Images of trapping, of fire, of the king of terrors. And he's just trying to describe the death of the wicked. He never, though, says, Job, this is you. He didn't have to. He implied it every time. He's saying, in essence, Job, when you die, because of what I see right now, you're going to the place of the wicked. Now again, remember, he had just lost all of his possessions. Even more onerous than that, all of his family. And what was the phrase that we kind of has as a catchphrase for his wife? What does she say to him? And then his friends, miserable counselors, they are called by Job, they're basically going, it's because you're wicked. All of this happened to you because you're wicked. And they just lay it out. How many of you want Zophar, Eliphaz, and Bildad as your closest friends? Raise your hand if that's who you want around you. Absolutely not. Clearly we don't want that kind of influence. Benefit, also, we don't want to be Bildad, Zophar, Eliphaz.
on some level, I can see the friends saying, I would approach it, did you do something that maybe caused God to be angry with you? Have him, but I certainly wouldn't keep poking the bear.
Yeah. Let me phrase it this way. It is my hope that I don't behave like his three friends did in the future. It is my intention that I don't behave like his three friends did in the present. But I can guarantee you with reflection that I have lived too close to those three in the past. Especially at times when I should have just kept my mouth closed. Zip it. And if we go back in time, it's not just when I'm younger. I was young and inexperienced. Absolutely true. 20-year-old Phil was an idiot, as a general rule. Even when he was trying to be wise, and even when he was wise. Because it happened. It just didn't happen regularly and consistently. I think some of the things that take place here happen to all of us at differing levels. And part of the reason that this is wisdom literature is it exposes it so clearly, all of us can see it quickly. But the more important thing is to realize, that's me too, in that context. So it then moves, and we get to the last word, most difficult word from Zophar. And he doesn't add anything new. There's no new arguments. He just gives a longer, harsher, more graphic version of what's already been said. The wicked taste evil as sweet, then vomit it back. God's wrath finds them. They lose everything. Heaven and earth eventually turn them against them. And this is the last time we hear Zophar in the text. He actually opens there in chapter 20 and says, I'm offended. He says, his troubled thoughts force him to answer because he has heard a rebuke, verse 3, that dishonors me. I think it's probably fair to conclude that Job's warning at the end of chapter 19, with the sword of judgment, pierced back. I think it's probably fair to then note that he's speaking out a bit of his wounded pride as much as he is theologically convinced that this is true. This is where you put that point and go, maybe that's where you and I have existed in the past. Where someone says something, we don't like what they said, we're arguing something maybe is logically true or necessary, but they bite back at us, and we go, bite right back at them. Take another nibble out of their existence, rather than reassess and back up and reconsider. Some of the things that are kind of important for us to catch, there's a couple of main ideas. One, the wicked have always suffered. In verse 5 it says, the mirth, in one translation, of the wicked is brief. The pride climbs to heaven, perishes like his own waste, flies away like a dream. These are powerful pictures of things that are taking place. The second one is another issue. It's the eating picture. Evil is sweet to the mouth, hidden under the tongue, savored and then kept. All images that the Bible uses, by the way, to describe the behavior of the unrighteous. But remember, every one of those passages and principles is now being weaponized to one man that they don't necessarily have the capacity to judge the behavior of. 2 points with that. One, we have the fourth wall view. We know Job's character better than they do. But the text is exposing their character better than they know. And their character is linked a bit to their theology, the things that they believe to be true, these principles they're holding in their mind. Before anything else, there's a couple of questions that I wanted just to kind of think about. But when you were reading through chapter 20 in advance of the class, or even just thinking about it this morning, what are some things that stood out to you, using our old metric of what did you like and not like, and how, because you're probably going to go to the second one, and how Zophar speaks?
He's wild. I mean, he is downright wild. There's no compassion at all. I mean, you can say things that are true. You know, it's not always what you say, but how you say it. He's just utter, I mean, he is just vile in this chapter.
Yeah. And a thing to remember in conversation that we don't always catch is, as much as it's important to know what you're saying and why you say it, one of the challenges is listening well enough when you say it to know how it's going to be received and how it's heard. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever been referred to as those people or you people? As a preacher, we get it all the time. You people. By the way, does that ever, when people say that, is it ever really intended in a positive way?
No.
Almost always. You people, you Christians, you put it whatever, you people. I understand the meaning behind it. I understand the intent behind it. It's a general thing. They've had some pain in the past. It's super easy to be offended. But if I were to say, you Democrats or you Republicans, do we say things like that sometimes? Are they generally potentially true? Well, it could be. Generalizations are truish because they're general. But guess what? I've yet to find anybody who truly agrees with either platform that they may vote for, 100%. And so when you begin to play the game of painting with a broad brush, you then paint over individuals who might disagree with 90% of the middle space they're trying to occupy. And that's in politics, which shouldn't be a big deal. But now we move more closer to home. Have you ever done that with your brethren? Generalize their views to a simplistic thing and forget that they're humans? Yeah, I think probably we could say, yeah, I've probably done that. What about your family? What about your spouse or your brother or sister physically? But there's one level that I think is important. What about yourself? Because you can treat yourself with the same kind of negative representation. Oh, I don't do that. Why do I always? You ever said that to yourself? Guess what? You've done the exact same thing that all of us do about everything, except rather than Job being in the spotlight, you are now treating yourself as if you're Zophar and Job at the same time. And guess what? You ain't going to win. Outcome's going to be the same. So the thread of this principle stretches inside and outside of this dialogue, all of our dialogues. And I think the wisdom literature in part is trying to push us to a deeper trust in God, individually, communally, relationally. And Job is doing that when it's probably the most difficult task, because he's the one under the thumb. Like, he's getting way more pressure than we do when we read it, but we feel with him, right? We emote with him. We can empathize or sympathize. Les?
We do similar stuff to them and really don't think about it. And but we kind of like to tell people they get their exercise by jumping to conclusions. And,
Yeah.
We're pretty quick to, a harsh way of saying it is judging people.
Yeah.
And, we kind of soften it down and use other terms, like, conclusions. But we're way too quick to speak without knowing all the facts.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what it boils down to me.
Yeah. And American culture, modern U.S. culture, even culture amongst our closest friends does that really well. You ever see a photo of somebody doing something somewhere and you immediately know what they were doing? You realize that's a millisecond snapshot of the moment, and it may or may not represent anything at all. I mean, you could have someone at their worst day ever, and they catch the photo just right, and they're smiling. Or it could be the best day ever. And look, I'm a pretty awkward photo subject, and so it's going to look weird. Like, it's just how it is. Those are the realities we live in. And part of what we're seeing here is Zophar's theology is making that view of life normal. It's normal to be judgmental. It's normal to assume that bad circumstances exist because of personal rebellion. The parallel questions that I think are most important from chapter 2 or chapter 20 are this. The first one is, how does the cross respond to the legitimate wrath of God that Zophar is talking about? Because that part of his speech is true. God's wrath is real. How does the cross answer that?
Grace.
Yeah, and grace is the powerful tool. By the way, when we say grace in the biblical sense, it's super important not to minimize it down to that accessible definition as unmerited favor. It's accurate, but that's like saying that the ocean is the same as a kiddie pool. Those are not the same concepts, because grace, as represented in the Bible, is a substantial truth that fills corners and edges of humanity. It goes from a story that goes from Genesis to recreation of all things in the conclusion of a place to be with God. Like, it's just so expansive. So it's like unmerited favor. True, in the same way that a kiddie pool carries water and the oceans contain the seas. Like, that's about that truth there. So that's part of it. Anything else that's important to catch? Les, did you have something you're thinking?
Yeah, I am thinking that we get, through the cross, we get rewarded for the kind of behavior, the kind of life we live. We'll be judged and go to one or two places. Somewhere along the line, it had to be a pretty prevalent idea among these people that because God does have wrath, that they got the idea that if something happened to you, you've done something bad. Apparently that was kind of a prevalent idea for a good long period of time back in
Well, if you just survey the Bible and pick the bad parts, you got a flood, you got the Tower of Babel business, you got God doing this and that, and you just pick the parts that match the story, you have what I've sometimes referred to as the telegraph, where I'm here, and my idea I want to go to is over there, and so I'm going to put a line of telephone poles and run up a telegraph line, and it's only going to go there, and I'm just going to follow those poles. But I'm not going to pay attention to the valley over there, tumbleweed right there, the lush upper meadows over here. I'm not going to pay attention to those because my destination's already decided. I now believe that God's wrath is the most important theological truth of the Old Testament, of the Bible, of everything. The other part of the cross, I think, is connected to what Les is talking about as the response to it, is that in the cross, we get a compassionate, experiential judge who has experienced moral humanity in a uniquely different incarnational way. And so when he is the judge who's judging us, it's different than, I don't want Zophar judging me. He's shared in the human experience, but he's not just. He's not compassionate. And so we get that in the cross. The second question that ties into it is the application side, and it's the hard side. tempts me to be like Zophar. It's a truth that it doesn't go away. We would love to think that we've evolved morally beyond it. I've matured. I don't behave like Zophar. Clearly I don't. Is that, if I say that, you guys catch the latent sarcasm in that? Like, so the reflective side is what makes me behave that way. Like, humorously, if someone tells me Jack in the Box has good tacos, I'm quick to judge. They have things labeled as such on their menu, and in desperation, I will absolutely eat them. But I really wouldn't qualify them as good tacos, right? We can all agree that that's Phil being judgmental, and you might even agree with me with my conclusion. But is it really that important? Not a big deal. Might I get up high and mighty about it? It's possible. That's a light thing. What if I think it's really important? What if it's moving off of immaterial things, not mattering things, and getting just kind of near spiritual things, just adjacent? We're not really in the realm of things that the Bible conclusively says do or do not at this point. We're just kind of adjacent. Could we be tempted to be judgmental then?
I think we all can.
Yeah. The real important question is to ask why. Why have I trained myself to be judgmental about something that maybe not crossed the line just yet? And then also, why is judgmentalism as a concept my only response? Why is this the only way that I know how to respond to a feeling of discomfort? Fear's a big part of it. How many of us fundamentally believe that our childhood was better than the childhood on average of the current American citizen?
100%.
Guess what? Every generation said that. And I talk to kids who are in their mid-20s about kids being raised today. You know what they say? Same thing. Ask them what an iPad kid is, and they'll be like, they know. Even though in some ways they themselves were the early arrivals to being the iPad kids. My generation included latchkey kids who came home with a key, opened the house, just went in. Mom and Dad were not there because they weren't home from work yet. That is the presumption of experience, saying my experience is better than theirs. Well, we haven't lived theirs. And theirs might be better. And on the individual level, I can tell you that some of the experiences of being raised in my generation were awful. Just horrible. Someone asked the question, this is the way to think about it. Think back to the movies that were made during your childhood. How many of them were kind of, in retrospect, that were really popular, that you liked and watched, are like super problematic? My brain went, all of them. Like every single one of them. Like every single one. Even to a degree, some of the G-rated-ish children's movies. I'm sure they existed. My brain really thought about it a long time. There were good movies made. It doesn't mean my childhood was better than my kid's childhood, or worse, but we feel that way. All these things then can manifest when someone's life breaks down. Oh, it's the way they were raised. Well, who raised them? We did. If you complain about kids today, who raised them? We did. Or we raised their parents. And the self-reflection says, don't be Zophar. Grow like Job and think one step further. Because Job comes back and puts his finger and goes, what about when the wicked do well? Your theology friend, and I use that loosely because he's not really speaking in those terms, it's kind of broken when you see the world that way. The bulk of this comes early in the text. Because Job's going to make an ask. He says, I want you guys to listen. Verse 2 of chapter 21, the best comfort his friends can give him right now is hearing, is listening. So in the biblical text, the best job his friends did was sit silent and listen to him speak. Because when they spoke, again, they were referred to as miserable comforters. A title none of us want to get. And he even says, after I speak, you can mock if you want. But there's a problem, because in verse 4, this is for us to think about, he's going to re-angle off of their theology and talk about where's God. He's going to angle towards God. He even warns them to put their hand over their mouth, because what he is about to say even terrifies himself. Verses 5 and 6. He'll run down a couple of key things. The good life of the wicked. They keep living on. They grow old. They increase in power. Their offspring get situated before his eyes. Even more so, he acknowledges that these people who prosper say to the God who makes the heavens, depart from us. We do not desire the knowledge of your ways. What is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit do we get if we pray to him? And then he echoes one of his friend's statements. How often is it that the lamp of the wicked is put out? His answer, not very often. Then he ascends to the table of Ecclesiastes a little bit. One man dies fat and at ease with full pails of milk and marrow in his bones. Another dies in bitterness of soul, having never tasted prosperity. They lie down together in the dust, and the worms cover them both. It is same as the modern truism that at the end of the game, both the king and the pawn go back in the same box. Same truth. Except Job says it in a way that is more grating, with the cheese grater to the soul.
Well, we have a tendency to think in our own circumstances. So we don't have a lot of money, we struggle to pay bills, and you know, life's a struggle. But then we look at somebody who's rich, who's got all the money in the world. But yet, and I've always thought this, the fact that you have money doesn't make your life easier. You just have another set of problems.
We can, and intellectually, we can acknowledge it's true while still struggling with envy. All of us envy what we don't have. We get greedy for stuff. And greedy isn't about cash. We can be greedy for a lifestyle. I've got friends who have, over the course of their lives, desperately wanted a family situation that they never had. A stable marriage, children who are involved. They never had a stable marriage. They were married, but it was never stable. The children that were brought into their lives have created a context that was extra stressful due to health complications. Good kids, but their bodies just don't work the way we want their bodies to work. It's not an easy place to be. There's not every problem is due to an individual's failure that they have to carry. Some problems you carry because they're just the ones you picked up that day. Some of us also choose to take them up. There's a load sitting there, I'm going to carry it. Oh, I made a bad decision, but I'm not going to drop it. I'm not going to let go. There's a closing part of this that's an echo to some of the things that have been said earlier. Hot air, the whole hot air dialogue. Job 21:34. How then will you comfort me with empty nothings? There is nothing left of your answers but falsehoods. In essence, he's saying, if we turn this story to the outside, and apply your theology to everyone around us, it doesn't hold water. Because you said this was all taken from me because I had sinned. And yet the world is full of those who have sinned and who have retained everything. This is how all of us at some point or another will feel. And it's as much as we're talking about, okay, we got Bible passages, we're holding these two things together. The third tier of that triad is how we feel. And feelings don't determine theology, they don't determine destinations or souls, but they are a component of how we reason through life, how we think through problems, how we respond, or are we willing to respond to what's going on. So the first big question, so you got to go before the big question.
How much, I mean, since this whole story is Satan telling God, or God telling Satan, have you considered my servant Job, and put him in these straits that he's in? How much of the dialogue that we're having and the friends, first being silent, probably the best thing they could have done, and then their responses so harshly to Job, is Satan's worming his theology through their responses.
You ask a question that was privately asked of me last week, or maybe the week before, because that's a truism of the father of lies. At what level is the adversary, evil, sin in the dialogue of his friends? And I want you to think about the way in which false teaching spreads in any community. Does error come in because someone brought a sign and said, this is from the devil, you should believe it? The devil says. No, even the devil does. You know what God actually said.
Yeah, the devil knows the scriptures.
But even so, he also knows the heart of man. And so these three humans who are judgmental, they carry with them whatever it is that's brought in. So on some level, the answer is yes. The challenge is it's never explicitly told to us at what level. And the best that I can determine is that this is not the devil manipulating the outcome per se, or the hedges being removed, but this is just the issue of humanity accepting something that isn't true and running with it. Two realities. The prevailing theory in a lot of evangelical or Baptist communities would be combined the theology of the tulip or premillennialism, those two concepts. Those are both relatively new ideas. Let's just say roughly the last 300 years where they got really popular. But in those worlds, they're just absolutely to be true. That no, you can't lose your salvation. No, there's only everyone's already predetermined who's going to heaven. Oh, and by the way, there's going to be this cool battle at the end. That's my $2 definition of a $100 word. It's super exciting. It's thrilling. We can make some movies. We can get people interested. Oh, by the way, you don't have to worry about your soul anymore because it's already worked out. If you're committed, you're in. If you're not committed, you're out. The math never maths out to whatever theory they have, but it makes them feel good. So I don't see any difference in their accepting that lie and Job's friends accepting these lies. The devil's definitely involved. At what level? Orchestration level. Same level we see at the beginning of the story. God allows it to be so. Same thing for us. We live in the same world Job lives. We have to deal with this kind of stuff all the time. In 21:19 and 21, Job does something that Paul does that is an echo of Christ. He wishes that the punishment of the wicked would fall on himself other than his children. It's like a sensitive interlude to a certain degree that's counter to some of his building faith. Paul says the same thing, right? What does Paul say regarding Israel? His countrymen? I would die if it means that they would turn to the kingdom. And what does Jesus literally do? So that they would turn to the kingdom. So the question that Job asks, as an echo of Job 19 and a reframing of the entire text, gets answered fully in Christ. It's a wonderful kind of full turn from beginning to the close. Here's a couple of things that I think are super important. Number one is a question. You're probably going to meet someone in the next 3 weeks that has a hint of Job's life. Maybe not so much personally, but maybe they just read the news. And sometimes the news feels as bad as Job's life. What are you going to say to them? How do you comfort someone who asks a question maybe like, all this stuff happened, where's God? What do you tell someone who's been through that mess? That's like the core question to ask, right? By the way, it's not an easy one. I made no promises that all questions in this class were going to be the easy one. In fact, I've tried to stress that this is probably full of some of the hardest questions in life. Trent, you're paying attention back there. I know you got an answer to this question, but not a good one.
I mean, it's tough. That's a tough question. I mean, it's hard to answer it perfectly. I mean, God is in all and ever present. But so is darkness on earth.
Yeah. Part of my start to answer that question is I have to figure out first how to trust God when he brings suffering, so I can also recognize joy in the way that I should. Not just physically it feels good, but rationally. But beyond that, I have to ask other side questions. Is what I'm seeing here representative of the whole picture? Can I see everything I need to see to answer this question? Part of the answer to that is going to always be no. Even with modern communication that allows me to call friends across the globe and talk to them in real time, I don't know everything that I need to know to answer that question. And my biblical illustration of that is simplified. So let's talk about Joseph. Because even as Joseph's faith seems to get weird, like he dresses like an Egyptian, he marries into the Egyptian family. If the song was available, he might be dancing like an Egyptian, walking like an Egyptian. He and the Bengals will be hanging out eventually because he's indistinguishable from them. He doesn't look Israelite anymore. And yet, in reflection, he says this was God's hand. He says, I suffered so that I could save. And while it doesn't answer why does God let today's evil exist, it begins to answer why it might be answered. But it reminds me, I don't know. I don't know just yet. But my God did this in the past to someone who seemed to be going through an awful lot. And he was able to figure it out at the end. Guess what? You and I can too. That's a start to the question, to answer the question. It's an answer. Because I think there's about 7 more we can come up with. Cecilia?
I was just going to say in Ephesians where it talks about there we fight against not evil and principalities, that there are forces at work that God has to work through as well.
Yeah.
That create
And if the person I am talking to is living the Job experience, they're living the Joseph experience, I might soften all of that, back it up a little bit. Because there's even more I don't know. I don't actually know how they feel.
Yeah.
They can tell me, and I can see it, but I don't actually know how they feel. Tyler?
So, and this is challenging for me, but when you read something in the news, I think often the question is, someone genuinely wants to have a conversation with us, ask them, how does this personally affect you? Like, this particular event, how are you affected by this personally? Because then you can kind of more sensibly have a conversation with them, rather than, again, you were talking about before, just whitewashing or painting with a wide brush. They might be related to somebody who's personally affected by this, and otherwise you're not really approaching it in a graceful way, which is not a godly way to answer a question.
Yeah, here's a straight illustration from the news. Back, all of us remember the tragedy that took place at Sandy Hook, right? We're aware of that. I had friends who were skeptics regarding the politicization of it. I had to remind them, these were friends who were members of the church, that the children of Christians attended and experienced the event. They were there. There's people I know that were present there. And so as much as you may feel that, hey, this is not being handled properly in the news, humans experienced this, and it was awful and harsh. We don't know those things, and so wisdom comes in backing up for a second and thinking, hey, maybe this is not us. Maybe this is them. And we let them experience it, and then we support them afterwards. And maybe it doesn't have to have my decision as to whether it's done right, because I'm not the one making the decisions anyway. I can back off and live in a separate world. That's it for our class this morning. We'll be continuing in chapter 22 through 25, roughly. More like 22 to 24 next week. But thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your presence and your